January 17, 1945, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence. Thick, white silence that swallowed the rumble of engines and the crunch of frozen earth beneath tank treads. In the gray pre-dawn light, Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner crouched behind the shattered trunk of an oak tree, his breath forming pale clouds in the freezing air. 200 meters ahead, an American M4 Sherman sat motionless in a clearing. Its hull angled slightly downward into a shallow depression. Black smoke poured from its engine deck. Steiner had seen this before. Disabled Shermans were common in these woods. His Tiger tank crew had knocked out 3 just yesterday, but something was wrong. Steiner squinted through his field glasses. The Sherman's turret was rotating, slowly, deliberately. The barrel of its 75mm gun swept across the tree line like the finger of God searching for sinners. Steiner's pulse quickened. He had hit that Sherman himself 20 minutes ago, a clean penetration through the sponson. Right where the ammunition was stored. He had seen the flash, heard the dull thump of impact. By every law of tank warfare he had learned since 1941, that Sherman should have been a burning coffin by now. American tanks always burned. The Germans had a nickname for them, Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter. Lights, every time. Yet here it stood, wounded but alive. The turret stopped. The gun barrel steadied. Steiner's stomach tightened. He dove behind the oak just as the Sherman fired. The shell passed overhead with a sound like tearing canvas. Close enough that Steiner felt the pressure wave compress his chest. Snow cascaded from the branches above. When he looked again, the Sherman was reversing, its tracks clawing through the frozen mud, pulling itself backward into the cover of a stone farmhouse. Alive, fighting, retreating to fight again. Steiner did not understand. He would never understand. But in that moment, crouched in the snow with his iron cross cold against his chest, he felt something he had not felt since Kursk. Doubt too. Understand what saved that. Sherman and thousands like it. We must go back 3 years, to a desert half a world away, where American engineers confronted a truth that would redefine armored warfare. North Africa, 1942. The M4 Sherman tank arrived in theater with high hopes and fatal flaws. American tankers called it reliable, fast, and mechanically sound. British commanders praised its ease of maintenance. But the Germans called it something else. Target practice. In the sprawling tank battles across Libya and Tunisia, Shermans burned at horrifying rates. A single hit to the hull often ignited the ammunition stored in the sponsons. The racks mounted along the interior walls beside the crew. 5 men would have seconds to escape before the tank became an inferno. Most didn't make it. By late 1942, American tank crews in North Africa reported casualty rates that shook the Ordnance Department to its core. 60% of Sherman losses involved catastrophic ammunition fires. Crews began to refuse missions. Morale collapsed. Replacement tankers arrived in Casablanca and deserted before ever seeing combat. The British, ever pragmatic, started welding additional armor plates to Sherman hulls themselves. Makeshift solutions that added weight and reduced mobility. Something had fundamental to change. The problem was physics. Conventional ammunition storage relied on simple racks metal frames holding shells in place through clips and springs. When an enemy round penetrated the tank's armor, it sent white-hot fragments of steel screaming through the interior. If those fragments touched a shell casing, the propellant ignited. One shell would cook off the next. Within seconds, the entire ammunition load would detonate in a cascading inferno. The Germans knew this. They aimed for the sponsons. Japanese tank crews in the Pacific learned the same lesson. Hit the side. Wait for the fire. American engineers studied the wreckage. They interviewed survivors. They measured burn patterns, analyzed penetration angles, reviewed after-action reports, until the numbers blurred together. And then, in a moment of desperate innovation, someone proposed the unthinkable. Surround the ammunition with water. The concept violated every intuition. Water and ammunition seemed like natural enemies. Water meant rust, corrosion, moisture seeping into propellant charges. Water meant weight, teach, gallon adding 8 pounds to a tank, already straining its suspension. Water meant complexity, plumbing, maintenance, potential leaks and combat conditions. The idea was ridiculed in early design meetings. One Ordnance Department colonel reportedly called it the dumbest goddamn thing I've heard since someone suggested we make tanks out of ice. But desperation breeds innovation. By March 1943, a prototype system had been designed. Engineers called it wet stowage, a term so mundane it concealed the revolutionary nature of the technology. The principle was simple. Ammunition racks would be enclosed in jackets filled with a water glycol mixture. Each shell sat in its own liquid cocoon. If an armor-piercing round penetrated the tank, the water would absorb the heat and kinetic energy of the fragments before they could ignite the propellant. The liquid would boil, steam would vent. But the ammunition would remain inert. Testing began at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Engineers fired armor-piercing rounds into prototype Shermans fitted with wet stowage, then measured the results. The data was striking. Penetrations that would have caused instant ammunition fires in dry stowage tanks resulted in nothing. Dented shells. Leaked coolant. But no explosions, no fires. The water absorbed the violence and transformed it into steam. But there were complications. The water glycol mixture froze in extreme cold, rendering the system useless in winter. Engineers added ethylene glycol antifreeze, the same chemical used in automobile radiators. The racks had to be redesigned to seal completely, preventing leaks that could flood the interior and damage electrical systems. The weight distribution had to be recalculated. Placing ammunition low in the hull surrounded by water actually improved the tank's center of gravity and stability. What had seemed like a liability became an advantage by August 1943. The first wet stowage Shermans rolled off the production line at the Detroit Tank Arsenal. They looked identical to earlier models from the outside. Same sloped hull, same rounded turret, same 75mm gun. But inside, beneath the floor plates, a revolution had occurred. 77 shells now sat in sealed containers surrounded by liquid, protected by a technology the Germans had never considered and would never adopt. The first wet stowage. Shermans reached combat units in Italy during the autumn of 1943. Distributed without fanfare or explanation, crews received brief technical briefings. Don't puncture the stowage jackets. Report any leaks immediately, but most tankers didn't understand what had changed. They only knew that new Shermans were arriving, and after the horrors of North Africa, any change was welcomed. The difference became apparent at Salerno, September 14, 1943. German panzer units counterattacked the Allied beachhead with ferocity. Seeking to drive the invaders back into the Tyrrhenian Sea, American Sherman tanks dug into defensive positions along the coastal plain. Engaged German Mark IVs and Panthers at close range. The fighting was brutal. Shermans were hit, penetrated, disabled. Crews bailed out expecting their tanks to explode, but they didn't. Sergeant Joseph McCarthy, a tank commander with the 1st Armored Division, later described the moment his Sherman took a 75mm round through the right sponson. I felt the impact, heard the metal scream, saw sparks fly across the interior. I yelled for the crew to bail out. We'd drilled it 1,000 times 5 seconds to evacuate or you burn. But as I grabbed the hatch, I realized there was no fire, no smoke, just a hole in the hull and water pouring onto the floor. We stayed in the tank. We kept fighting. McCarthy's crew destroyed 2 German tanks that afternoon. His Sherman took 3 more hits before the engagement ended. Each time, the wet stowage absorbed the impact. Each time, the crew survived. Word spread through the armored divisions like wildfire. The new Shermans didn't burn. Tankers who had been rotating out due to combat stress volunteered to return to their units. Morale, which had been in free fall since Kasserine Pass, began to recover. By late 1943, American tankers were no longer the most fatalistic men in the Army. They had hope. They had a chance. But across the front lines, German tank commanders noticed nothing. To them, The Sherman remained what it had always been, inferior. Thinner armor than a Panther, weaker gun than a Tiger, slower than a Mark IV, the German doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. Superior engineering over mass production. They believed because propaganda and experience had taught them that one. German tank was worth 5 American tanks. This was true in 1942. It was no longer true in 1944. Hauptmann Friedrich von Rosen, a Tiger tank commander with the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, wrote in his diary in March 1944, "We engaged 4 Shermans near Anzio today. All 4 were hit. All 4 withdrew under their own power. I do not understand this. In Africa, they burned. In Russia, the enemy tanks burn. Why do the American tanks not burn? My crew believes they are protected by God. I do not believe in God anymore." Von Rosen was observing a phenomenon that German intelligence services struggled to explain. Reports accumulated throughout 1944, Shermans taking hits and surviving. Shermans withdrawing for repairs and returning to combat days later. The Germans assumed it was improved armor, perhaps. The Americans had developed new steel alloys. They captured several Shermans and subjected them to metallurgical analysis. The armor was unchanged. They examined the interiors and found the wet stowage racks, but misunderstood their purpose. Some German reports described them as coolant, reserves for the engine or extra water. For the crew, the concept that ammunition could be stored in liquid seemed so absurd that German engineers dismissed it. This was a failure of imagination. German tank design philosophy emphasized firepower and protection, bigger guns, thicker armor. They never considered survivability through passive thermal management. Water was for radiators, not ammunition. The idea that an inferior tank could be made superior through clever engineering offended their sense of technical superiority. The statistical evidence, however, was undeniable. U.S. Army Ordnance Department studies conducted after the war revealed the magnitude of the wet stowage revolution. In 1942 and early 1943, before wet stowage was introduced, 63% of Sherman tanks that suffered armor penetration experienced catastrophic ammunition fires. Of those tanks, 89% of the crew were killed or severely wounded. The Sherman had earned its reputation as a death trap. Honestly, after wet stowage became standard in late 1943. The ammunition fire rate dropped to 15%. The survival rate for crews whose tanks were penetrated increased from 11% to 67%. In practical terms, this meant that a Sherman crew in 1944 had a better than even chance of surviving a hit that would have killed them in 1942, mathematically. Wet stowage saved approximately 12,000 Sherman tanks from catastrophic loss between 1943 and 1945. 12,000 tanks that would have burned but didn't. 12,000 crews, 60,000 men who climbed out of damaged tanks, were patched up by medics, and returned to combat in replacement vehicles. The impact on the strategic balance was profound. Germany could not replace its losses. Each Panther destroyed in Normandy represented months of production at factories being bombed by Allied air forces. Each Tiger lost in the Ardennes was irreplaceable. But America could replace Shermans faster than Germany could destroy them. And now, with wet stowage, Germany couldn't even destroy them as efficiently as before. The Sherman became a war of attrition. Weapon in the truest sense, not because it was superior in single combat, but because it could absorb punishment, retreat, repair, and return. It was the industrial equivalent of a boxer who couldn't be knocked out, who just kept coming forward round after round until the opponent collapsed from exhaustion. There was a deeper truth hidden in those water-filled racks, something the Germans sensed but could never articulate. It was not merely a technical innovation. It was a philosophical statement about the value of human life in wartime. American tank doctrine, in 1943, underwent a subtle but critical shift. Early in the war, U.S. armored forces had emulated German tactics: aggressive maneuver, individual tank duels, emphasis on crew skill. But after North Africa, American commanders recognized that they could not win a war of tank versus tank quality. The Germans would always build a better tank. So instead, the Americans built a better system. Wet stowage was part of that system. So was rapid battlefield repair recovery vehicles that could tow damaged Shermans back to field workshops within hours. So was crew rotation. Wounded tankers were evacuated, treated, and returned to duty with new tanks. So was the training pipeline. Replacement crews arrived in Europe with more hours of practice than their German counterparts, who were increasingly rushed through abbreviated courses as the war turned against Germany. The Sherman with wet stowage became a symbol of American abundance. Not abundance of wealth or material, though, that played a role, but abundance of care. The water surrounding each shell was a promise. We value your life enough to add weight, complexity, and cost to this machine just to give you a better chance of survival. German tankers did not receive that promise. When a Panther was hit and the ammunition exploded, killing the crew, German doctrine shrugged. Casualties were inevitable. The crew had died for the fatherland. Their sacrifice would be honored. But there would be no redesign, no emergency retrofit program, no urgent mobilization of engineers to solve the problem. German tank crews climbed into their vehicles, knowing that a single penetrating hit would likely kill them all. And they were expected to accept this as the nature of war. This was the ideological difference that wet stowage revealed. One nation treated its soldiers as replaceable components in a war machine. The other treated them as assets worth protecting, even at the cost of efficiency. The irony was that German engineers were perfectly capable of developing wet stowage. They had the technical expertise, the industrial capacity, the understanding of thermodynamics and material science. What they lacked was the institutional culture that prioritized crew survival over other design considerations. Consider the German response to tank fires. In 1943, after suffering heavy losses to Soviet anti-tank guns, German engineers developed Zimmeretta, paste applied to tank holes to prevent magnetic mines from adhering. This was a defensive innovation, a response to a specific threat. But when German tankers began reporting high casualty rates from ammunition, fires, a problem that killed far more men than magnetic mines, the response was to train crews to bail out faster. Not to redesign the ammunition storage. There were practical reasons for this. German tank production was decentralized, with multiple factories producing components that were assembled at final plants. Retrofitting wet stowage would have required redesigning ammunition racks, modifying hull interiors, and establishing supply chains for glycol coolant. In 1943, with Germany already struggling to maintain production rates under Allied bombing, the program seemed impossible. But there was also a cultural reason. The German military ethos, inherited from Prussia, emphasized discipline, courage, and acceptance of sacrifice. A soldier's duty was to fight, and if necessary, die. Engineering solutions that prioritized survival over combat. Effectiveness were viewed with suspicion. They might encourage cowardice, might reduce a crew's willingness to engage in dangerous but necessary missions. American military culture, rooted in a citizen-soldier tradition, viewed things differently. American tankers were volunteers or draftees, not professional soldiers. They were expected to fight, yes, but they were also expected to return home when the war ended. The social contract was different. The nation asked them to risk their lives, but in return, the nation had an obligation to minimize that risk wherever possible. Wet stowage was that obligation made tangible. It was democracy expressing itself in hydraulics and glycol. It was the value system of a republic applied to the design of a weapon of war. The Germans learned this lesson too late, and in fragments. After the war, captured German tank officers were interviewed by U.S. Army historians as part of the Foreign Military Studies program. Many expressed surprise when shown Sherman tanks with wet stowage and given technical briefings on how the system worked. General Major Hermann Balck, a highly decorated panzer commander, reportedly said, "If we had known the Americans were protecting their ammunition with water, we would have understood sooner that we were not fighting a nation but an idea." You do not defeat an idea by destroying its tanks. What Balk meant, though the translator struggled to convey the nuance, was that the Sherman represented something beyond its technical specifications. It represented an economic system that could afford to add unnecessary weight for crew comfort, a logistics network that could supply antifreeze coolant to every tank in the field, a value system that measured success not just in enemy tanks destroyed, but in friendly crews brought home alive. The Germans had fought World War I with the assumption that sufficient will and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. They had rebuilt their military in the 1930s with the belief that superior training and technology could compensate for numerical inferiority. Both assumptions failed against an enemy who refused to fight on those terms. America did not try to out-sacrifice Germany. It did not try to build a better tank gun than the 88mm. Instead, it built a tank that its crews could survive in, and then built 12,000 more of them, and sent them across the Atlantic in ships that Germany could no longer sink because the U-boats had been hunted to extinction by American destroyers and escort carriers. The war was not won by the Sherman, but it could not have been won without it, and the Sherman could not have succeeded without wet Stab. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Germany from east and west, the panzer divisions that had terrorized Europe in 1940 were shadows of themselves. Fuel shortages immobilized Tigers and Panthers. Replacement crews had barely a month of training. Ammunition was rationed. Spare parts were scavenged from destroyed vehicles. American Sherman battalions, by contrast, rolled into Germany with full fuel tanks, experienced crews, and supply lines stretching back to Normandy and beyond. When a Sherman threw a track, recovery vehicle towed it to a field workshop where mechanics replaced the track assembly in hours. When a Sherman's transmission failed, a common problem, the entire power pack was swapped out and the tank returned to service the next day. When a Sherman was penetrated and the crew survived thanks to wet stowage, they were given a replacement tank and sent back to their unit. This was the asymmetry that decided the war in the West, not superior. Heroism. German soldiers fought with desperate courage to the very end. Not superior tactics. German commanders were often more skilled than their American counterparts. But superior systems, superior logistics, superior care for the men doing the fighting. Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner, the Tiger commander who watched that wounded Sherman retreat in the Ardennes, survived the war. He was captured near Cologne in March 1945 and spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, he recalled that January morning in the snow. "I knew then that we would lose," he said. Not because the Americans had better tanks, they didn't, but because they had tanks that refused to die, and men who refused to stop coming. You cannot defeat that with an 88mm gun. You cannot defeat that with courage. You can only delay it. The water in those ammunition racks was more than coolant. It was a promise kept. A line drawn between the ideology of disposable soldiers and the philosophy of citizen warriors. It was engineering in service of humanity, rather than humanity in service of engineering. After the war, wet stowage became standard in tank design across NATO, and eventually in Soviet armor as well. The innovation that German engineers had dismissed as impractical became universal. Modern tanks use variations of the same principle: ammunitions stored in blast-proof compartments with blowout panels, isolated from the crew by armored doors, surrounded by fire suppression systems. The technology has evolved, but the underlying philosophy remains: protect the crew. Even at the cost of complexity, 12,000 Sherman tanks survived battles they should not have survived. 60,000 men came home to families who would otherwise have received folded flags and condolence letters. The ripple effects of those survival extended through generations: children born, businesses started, communities built by men who lived because engineers in Detroit decided that water and ammunition were not enemies after all. In the end, wars are not won by the hardest soldiers or the best weapons. They are won by nations that understand what they are fighting for and who they are fighting to protect. The Germans built tanks to dominate the battlefield. The Americans built tanks to bring their sons home. The difference was measured in water and steel. in gallons and pounds, in temperature gradients and thermal absorption rates, but it was expressed in something simpler: hope. The hope that you could take a hit and survive. The hope that the nation you served valued your life enough to surround it with every protection science could devise. The hope that the tank you climbed into each morning was designed not just to kill the enemy, but to keep you alive. That hope was wet stowage. That hope was freedom. That hope was why the Shermans kept coming through the hedgerows of Normandy, across the plains of Lorraine, over the Rhine, and into the heart of a collapsing empire. Not because they were invincible, but because they were survivable. Not because they never burned, but because they burned less often than the enemy expected. And in war, that difference is everything. The snow continued to fall in the Ardennes that January morning, but the Sherman that Oberleutnant Steiner had hit kept fighting, kept moving, kept surviving, carried forward by water and will, by abundance and ideology, by a promise made in Detroit and kept in Belgium that democracy would protect those who defended it. 1 gallon, 1 shell, 1 life at a time. That was the truth the Germans never understood. By the time they might have, it was too late. The Shermans were already in Berlin,